The legend of the Battle of the Alamo is sometimes bigger than the state of Texas itself. For generations, Texans have been told stories of the brave Alamo defenders that fought against Mexican dictatorship for the state's liberty and independence. The Battle of the Alamo has been depicted on the big screen.
What do you think, Jim?
And the small screen. And in comic books, with defenders portrayed as larger-than-life heroes. You can still find replicas of the coonskin hat that Davy Crockett is rumored to have worn. And merch with the phrase, "Remember the Alamo," isn't hard to come by. But while some of these things we have come to know about the Alamo are true, a lot aren't.
The truth is that there was a battle at the Alamo, and that people named William B. Travis and Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett died at that battle. Once you get beyond that, it becomes really, really fuzzy.
Chris Tomlinson is a columnist for the Express News and Houston Chronicle. Tomlinson co-wrote a book that's set to be released in June titled "Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of the American Myth." So let's start there. We've all heard that iconic saying, "Remember the Alamo," but the truth is, according to Tomlinson, it was mostly an afterthought.
The Alamo was largely forgotten after the Battle of 1836. And it only really came back into the public imagination after the Civil War, when Texans were looking for a new myth, a new origin story that did not include the baggage of slavery.
Those legendary myths include the story of William B. Travis drawing a line in the sand with his sword, as depicted in this scene from the 1950s Disney special, Davy Crockett at the Alamo.
Those who stay cross over the line.
There was no line in the sand. That was a story made up in the late 1800s.
And what about Davy Crockett's heroic death?
There were no professional historians before 1880. When they started digging into Alamo history, they only looked at what the white people said about what happened. And they conveniently left out some Mexican army reports, such as Travis offering to surrender the night before Santa Anna attacked, or the fact that Davy Crockett was captured alive and executed on Santa Anna's orders.
So what else happened and what's been exaggerated? Did William B. Travis actually write his victory or death letter? That's a fact. The letter, which was a plea for help when the Alamo was surrounded by Mexican troops, was written on February 24th in 1836. It was returned to the Alamo in 2013. Another popular myth? We've all been told there were no survivors after the battle. Well, that's fiction.
We like to say no one survived the Alamo, but that's not true. There was an entire Mexican army. There were dozens of Tejanos, Mexican Americans who had taken shelter. We have a lot of those stories, but because they weren't told by white people, they got left out.
We have some recent studies that were done that indicate that many of the Alamo defenders didn't stay there to fight to the last man. They left out of the eastern, southwestern walls, and understandably so. That doesn't necessarily mean they were cowards or they were running. It may have been they just saw there was no way they were going to win this war, and Travis was wrong.
And despite new revelations recently unearthed by historians, the myth of the Alamo remains strong. Hollywood has helped fuel this with multiple TV shows and movies depicting the battle dating all the way back to 1915.
I want to warn you all, I'm a screamer.
These films and TV shows have fed into the lore and made the Alamo and San Antonio a popular tourist destination.
I grew up here in San Antonio, and like many people, I thought about the Alamo. I saw the old John Wayne movie as a small child, and like many other people, was kind of captivated by the story they told, because it was a story of heroic people and who put up a good fight and tried to change the course of their destiny. And that's what I grew up with, but that's kind of like a very shallow explanation of the whole thing.
A lot of history is the truth as people believe it at that moment, or the truth as people want to present it at that moment. And humans like good stories, and I think that's probably why stories are embellished and changed. The stories of the Revolutionary War and George Washington, we're reevaluating all the time. And I think the Alamo is part of that formula of myth making and reevaluation.
And while these films and shows made many of the defenders larger than life figures, the truth is many were fighting for different causes during a volatile time in our state's history.
These are real people, they're not characters in a movie. And some of the people who were fighting at the Alamo were fighting for the causes they didn't even know had been written down in the declaration they hadn't even seen yet. And some are fighting for their buddies. I mean, I think a boy as young as 14, 15 was fighting for his buddies at that moment and not necessarily thinking about, what it meant to Mexico or what it meant to the future of Texas. They were fighting for their families and their friends.
We're at a point in time where young people in particular want to know the truth about what really happened, and they don't have a lot of tolerance for these stories that were invented as a way to perpetuate white supremacy. And sadly, we have people who can't accept that that's the origin of those myths, and that's the reason why we have to get rid of them.